Hi there, everybody. Welcome to Off the Charts football podcast for week 4 of the 2017 NFL season. I'm Aaron Schatz of Football Outsiders. I am here with Matt Manocherian of Sports Info Solutions to bring you our patented connection and combination of advanced stats, cool NFL charting, and random jokes and references. Matt, how are you this week?
I'm great, Aaron. Just enjoying another beautiful week of football. Nothing at all distracting from the game and what's really happening on the field.
No! God forbid anything should distract us from the game on the field. Why would we want that?
Anyway, we'll keep our discussion on the field today, I think it's safe to say.
Yes, that is true. We want to keep to football. We love football. That's why we do what we do. That's why we do the stats. That's why we do the charting. And I should remind everybody that, of course, that Off the Charts Football Podcast is always brought to you by Football Outsiders and Sports Info Solutions, premium data you can get on our site, especially the Sports Info Solution premium charting data with cornerback coverage, drops, broken tackles, play action data, all kinds of cool stats to help you learn about your team, maybe figure out what fantasy wide receiver you need to be playing because of the cornerback he's playing next week, plus our weekly fantasy projections. Those are also available for the season for $25, and you should check that stuff out at footballoutsiders.com.
And without further ado, let's get right into the week. And Aaron, we had some really odd things popping up on DVOA rankings this week. Can you explain to me what is going on there?
Yeah, boy, that was an odd week, huh? A lot of really good wins, upsets for underdogs, and the ratings got kind of scrambled. We only have 2 3-0 teams after 3 weeks, and that's pretty rare to have only 2 teams left at 3-0. One of them is Kansas City, and I think everybody basically agrees that Kansas City has been the strongest team in the league so far. I don't think there's a disagreement with the ratings on that.
I don't think anybody would say that necessarily. I don't think there's a consensus that they're definitely the best team going forward, but over the past 3 games, who's played the best? I think hands down it's been the Chiefs.
I mean, honestly, when the first of those 3 games is a win in Foxborough, like a dominating win over the Patriots, the other 2, as long as they're wins, I think people are going to see you as being that good. But the fact is that those other 2 wins have been good enough that even without any opponent adjustments yet, the Chiefs are the number 1 team. Now, what's interesting is the other 3-0 team, the Atlanta Falcons, we only have it number 9. And I know that that's probably going to be a surprise to some people because, you know, if there's 2 3-0 teams, you expect them to both be at the top. Maybe not 1 and 2, but, you know, 1 and 3 or 1 and 4. But the fact is that the Falcons have played really close games. The Bears were down to the Atlanta 4 by the end of the game with a chance to take a lead. And, of course, Detroit came within 1 yard of winning in week 3. In fact, I thought Detroit had won. I did not see that touchdown had been overturned until like a half an hour later on Twitter.
Right. It was hard to finally get the good view. Then we did. I think we all agree that it does appear that he was actually short of the end zone, but still such a bizarre end of the game. And yeah, it leaves us with Atlanta at 3-0, but with 2 very losable games. So I think it kind of makes sense that as DVOA is considering what the teams have done so far, Atlanta really hasn't performed like a top 5 team. They could have easily been 1 and 2. They probably, let's say they deserve to be 2 and 1. That's about where they are with the cast and crew of all the other 2 and 1 teams that we have through 3 games.
Yeah, what's interesting is that their ratings have sort of come out the way we sort of expected when we previewed the season, which is the defense has been slightly better than it was last year, but they're 20th right now. And obviously, again, opponent adjustments will come in. Green Bay and Detroit are tough offenses to face. The offense has not been quite as good as last year. The offense has been number 7 so far this year, and that I don't think is going to get adjusted at all because it's not like Detroit's been a good defense so far, but I don't think anybody thinks they're going to be a great defense in the long run.
And it would have been impossible
special teams have been really good. That's the one thing Atlanta's really had going for them is they're 3rd in the league so far in special teams.
Yeah, I was just going to say it would have been really hard for them to have been as good as they were last year on offense. You know, when you have a historically great season, we're always going to look for some sort of a regression to the mean, even if we still think they are a very good offense, which I think everybody does, and they're in the top 10 in both rushing and passing.
Yeah, I think that it's not like I don't think anybody thought Atlanta's offense was going to suddenly disappear. Just that it wasn't going to be the juggernaut that it was last year. And so far it hasn't been. But they've made it out with 3 wins, and that means that right now they're the favorites in the NFC, right? I mean, they're the only 3-0 team in the NFC. They look like they have a pretty nice dominating lead on the rest of their division. The other divisions, the NFC North and the West and East, are all much closer. So Atlanta looks like the clearest NFC team to go for a number one seed and another Super Bowl appearance of any team in the NFC. Now, what's interesting to me is,
I was going to say there are 2 points that I'd like to make, and one of them kind of goes along with just what you're saying. And then, so they're 3-0, and this is a weird case where they've underperformed compared to our expectations of how good they would look based on our eyes and how they look on a down-to-down basis, but they've outpaced how their performance in terms of what their record is, being 3-0 when they probably don't deserve to be 3-0, all things considered. So you could look at it two ways when this sort of thing happens in the NFL. The good news is you skated by and you're still undefeated and you've got a lead in your division. The bad news is this could be a bad omen going forward. We would expect that if you continue to play not as well as your record is indicating, then eventually your record's going to catch up to you.
Right. The difference there is that the bad omen is not that they're bad. The bad omen is that they are just one of the best teams in the NFC instead of the 3-0 record makes them look like they're clearly the best team in the NFC. So even if they, quote unquote, play down to what their DVOA says they've been so far, that still makes them one of the 2 or 3 best teams in the NFC. So it's not really that much of a thing to be worried about.
Right. The other point I wanted to make was that we looked kind of phase by phase at how they're doing. Pass offense, rush offense, pass defense, rush defense, special teams, and everything was pretty good like you laid out before. The one thing that was interesting was the pass defense, which has given up a lot of yards. But when you look more closely at that, I think their pass defense has actually performed really well. They're averaging less than 6 yards per attempt. And I think their only issue has been there in terms of helping them win and lose games is that they've only come up with 1 interception so far through 3 games, and they actually lead the league with 3 dropped interceptions. So in that case, with the interceptions, I would expect to see their interception production improve as we move forward because teams just don't tend to continue dropping interceptions over the course of the season.
Right, and the other thing is that even without getting the value of those interceptions, they're 13th in our ratings, pass defense, 31st in run defense.
So one other team that we wanted to talk about was the Pittsburgh Steelers. So Pittsburgh is second in DVOA despite losing this week. What is going on there?
So that's a really interesting one because I think there are so many indications that Pittsburgh is going to be better than what they've looked like so far. And you sort of see that in our ratings in part because of things that DVOA filters out that are sort of, non-predictive. And in part because of the Dave ratings, which combine DVOA so far with preseason projection. And because the Steelers' preseason projection was so high, they're now number 1 in the Dave ratings. So the first game against Cleveland looked really close and really tired. But here's the surprising thing about that game where they beat Cleveland 21-18. They outgained Cleveland 5.4 yards per play to 3.8 yards per play.
Wow.
The big difference in that game was penalties. 13 penalties for the Steelers versus 4 for the Browns. And I don't know if, that many penalties is really that predictive, especially if we're talking about how many penalties a team has over the whole season, but over just a single game. That's what made things close. And then this week with the Bears, right, the yardage was similar. The Steelers had 4.8 yards per play. The Bears, 4.9. But the Steelers had 2 fumbles, and Chicago recovered them both. Chicago had 5 fumbles, but Pittsburgh only recovered 1 of them. Plus, there are not going to be very many games where Pittsburgh has a field goal blocked, but not only blocked, but returned all the way to the 1-yard line so that the other team can kick a field goal and create a 6-point switch on the scoreboard. That is not a common occurrence. So I don't think that this, yes, we know about Pittsburgh's very strange history under Mike Tomlin of playing down to bad opponents on the road. The Cleveland game was evidence of that. The Chicago game was evidence of that. It's really hard to sort of quantify that because it's the kind of thing that for every other team seems to be a random chance. There's a pattern with Pittsburgh, and you have to keep asking yourself, how real is this pattern whenever we see this pattern with other teams, it dissipates immediately. As soon as you notice the pattern, the pattern will stop because, it's just a sample size thing. But with Pittsburgh, it just seems to be year after year after year that they play down to bad opponents on the road. But even when you consider that, they have been better than you would think from a 2-1 record where one of those wins was only by a field goal. And they haven't even really gotten their offense going yet, with Le'Veon Bell only averaging 3.5 yards per carry. I still think Pittsburgh is super dangerous and super well set up to make a march through the playoffs.
The most fascinating thing about Pittsburgh for me is their pass defense. So for years and years, we've been talking about the Steelers' pass defense and how it's a weak point. Every AFC championship game, it feels like we're talking about how they need to adjust what they do and move to something different. But so far this year, and maybe it has to do with addition they made of Joe Hayden right before the season started, their pass defense has been outstanding. So through 3 weeks, opposing QBs are 53 for 88 for 481 yards, 1 touchdown, and 2 picks. So that's over 3 games. They're throwing 60%, 5.7 yards per attempt, and just 160 yards per game. So Pittsburgh's pass defense has been downright stingy so far. Now, the quarterbacks that they've played against, we can certainly look at that. Again, small sample size. But this is a really positive sign that the Pittsburgh secondary might really be improving.
Well, the other thing there is, like, Hayden was garbage last year in Cleveland and has been honestly below average in charting stats for 3 or 4 years now. But this year so far, I mean, right, only 3 games. Okay, sure. But he is 14th in success rate with a 58% success rate. He's not quite as good in yards per pass. He's 45th at 8.4. But he's been much better this year in the Pittsburgh system with the help from the players around him. Shazier is balling like crazy at the linebacker position, just making tons of tackles. And Hayden could have been a help because the way they're using him, he's looking like a better player than he's been in Cleveland the last couple of years.
Yeah, I'd rather play corner behind the Steelers' pass rush year in and year out than the Browns, that's for sure.
Well, you did in the past. We'll see what happens when Myles Garrett gets healthy and some experience. But certainly the years that Hayden was there, I'm with you all the way.
Very true. Moving forward, our favorite thing of the week. We used to call it Tank Watch. I think, Aaron, you suggested a new term, Tankapalooza. Is that right?
Tankapalooza, baby.
So Tankapalooza, what did you want to discuss as far as that goes this week?
Well, I want to discuss the fascinating results of the playoff odds report that because the Jets won a game, the New York Giants are now in our top 5 teams likely to get the number 1 pick in the draft. And when you consider that Cincinnati is also 0-3, they're now 4th for the top pick, and the Chargers are now 0-3, they're now 7th for the top pick. Those are 3 teams that we have not thought about in terms of Tankapalooza, but 3 teams that are now in the race for the top pick. And certainly, I mean, Andy Dalton, people have debated his pros and cons for so long. He's like the very definition of average quarterback. And I say that in a good way. I don't think he's worse than average, but he's very average for an NFL starter. But the Giants and Chargers, right? I mean, we are now going on the 14th season in the league here for Eli Manning and Phillip Rivers. So I think they need to, they're going to get high picks, very likely. And they have to ask themselves, do they want to maybe get one of those quarterbacks in this draft? Is it time?
Yeah, so it's going to come down, of course, to the reports on the players. Obviously, you got to like the quarterback if you want to take him. You look at the Giants and the Chargers. I believe the Eli Rivers draft, I think was 2001. So
2004.
2004, okay.
Yeah.
So they're just in, what are they, about 36 right now?
Yep.
So they're getting there, but it's not, we see Tom Brady playing at 40, and so it's not necessarily like they're out the door this year. And it's an interesting thing. If you draft the next guy, you might be sitting there with a healthy quarterback who's still playing well 2-3 years from now, and then you sort of feel like, oh, well, why did we use that draft pick? Or you trade Jimmy Garoppolo type player and get your value back that way. So that's why I think it always does come back to if any of these teams end up the year being that high pick. And for, living in New York growing up, I could imagine a 2007 type Giants year where, as awful and as horrible as things look right now, I wouldn't be shocked to see them in the playoffs at 9-7 either.
Well, I mean, maybe. They are really way back. Even if they win this week, we have them going to the playoffs 4.4% of the time. Even if they win this week, they still only go to the playoffs 7.7% of the time.
Not very likely.
Sorry, what'd you say?
Not very likely.
No, not very likely. And of course, the Chargers, although they played really well in those first two games, we have them at 6.8%. They're just in a really tough division.
Yeah.
I think, though, here's my thought. I think Eli Manning is toast. He wasn't very good last year. He hasn't played very well this year. Obviously, some of it is the offensive line, but that's another reason to get a young quarterback. Usually a young quarterback, if you get one who's mobile, you don't want to get a pocket young quarterback because then you scar him for life with a bad offensive line. But a mobile young quarterback can help you somewhat neutralize the problem. He's 21st in DVOA so far this year. Rivers is 13th so far this year. I think Rivers has another year or two perhaps left. It's almost to the point where if the Chargers and Giants are both near the top of the draft, I think the Chargers have more of a possibility of getting a developmental quarterback. If I'm the Giants, I want a guy who can go right away, and I want to convince Eli to retire. I think it's over.
So I disagree with you. I just haven't seen as much evidence of a diminished skill set. And I go back to the old Don Shula. I don't know if I have the wording exactly correct, but he said, show me a good offensive line and I'll show you a good offense. And I think that's exactly what Eli's been the victim of.
Well, it's certainly part of it. There's no question about that. But it's not like the offensive line has been great with the Chargers the last couple of years. And I still think Rivers has looked better than Eli. I will say the thing about Brady and Peyton Manning lasting so long into their careers is that usually the best quarterbacks of history are the ones who should last the longest because they have the highest peak to drop from. And the fact is that Rivers has a higher peak to drop from than Eli Manning, and Tom Brady had a higher peak to drop from than either of them. So did Drew Brees, for that matter, which is why, Brees and Brady are 2 and 3 in DVOA so far this year. Jared Goff is number 1, which is insane.
Yeah.
But I think it would be, I'll tell you what would be really fascinating to me, is the storylines if the Jets and Giants both take a quarterback in the top 10 picks in the same year.
How about a number 1, 2 Jets-Giants draft pick? That would be a shame that it wasn't in New York like it used to be.
It would be a dream. That would be amazing. That would be amazing.
Let's talk about the most important games of the week. Aaron, which games this week are going to impact playoff odds the most? And those are the ones that we're going to focus our analysis on.
2 games between division rivals are the most important games for playoff odds. The first is Detroit at Minnesota, and then basically about the same amount of importance is Oakland at Denver. So Detroit and Minnesota is an early game on Sunday, and Oakland at Denver is one of the late games on Sunday.
With Minnesota, I would love to discuss the quarterback situation. So we saw Case Keenum absolutely lights out last week. He's actually 7th in the NFL in independent quarterback rating. And as a reminder, IQR is something that we track here at Sports Info Solutions, which removes drops, throwaways, spikes, and things of that nature from the equation and tells you just what the quarterback was responsible for. So it's on the same quarterback rating scale up to 158.3, but it'll be a little bit higher in terms of IQR because we're taking the drops out of there. Case Keenum is 7th in the NFL in that metric at 126, but Sam Bradford is number 1 at 151.3. Meanwhile, I happen to think that the best quarterback on their roster is currently on PUP. What do we make of their quarterback situation?
I would say that based on all of the data we have throughout his entire career, Case Keenum is not as good as he looked last week. I think Case Keenum has been better than anybody ever could have expected when he entered the NFL essentially as a hometown hero camp arm for the Houston Texans. Much better than anybody ever would have expected, and he has a nice long backup career, but he is not as good as he looked last week. And I think that the Vikings still have a better chance to win if Bradford is healthy or when Bridgewater returns. And if Bridgewater is healthy, I agree with you. I'm a big Bridgewater fan. I think Bridgewater is the best of the 3 of them. If they're all healthy, the problem is that if they're all healthy, when you're talking about Sam Bradford and Teddy Bridgewater at this point is a who the heck knows. What's interesting is I think in part the offense is going so well for the Vikings because those 2 main wide receivers are just kicking ass. Diggs is our number 1 guy in value so far. Thielen is number 6 in value. But here's interesting, small sample size, of course, only 3 games into the season. Detroit's defense has been far better than it was last year when it was last in the league. The pass rush has been better, and the coverage has been better on the outside. Darius Slay back after missing a lot of last year. But they're getting killed by slot receivers. They're 29th in the league in DVOA against other wide receivers. And the Vikings don't really have one of those. Like, it's two guys. It's Thielen and Diggs.
But Diggs will operate out of the slot some.
He will some, but fine. Move one of your better cornerbacks into the slot and let your weak cornerback cover Laquan Treadwell, and I think you're fine.
It'll be interesting to see how the Lions respond. I agree with you. So I'm looking at the home road aspect of this. Minnesota's been really good, and I think the quarterbacks have been helped by their beautiful new home stadium that they christened last year. The Lions, on the other hand, can the defense travel as well as it did when they played the Giants? Because I think they raised a lot of eyebrows in that game. Their pass defense, like you mentioned, opponent QB rating is at 70. They're tied for the league in passes defense, and they're second in the NFL with 7 interceptions. We were never worried about their ability to cover over the middle of the field, but the outside guys certainly have shown some improvement. I'll be very interested to see how they can match up against Stephon Diggs, who's a guy that I scouted when he was coming out of Maryland. I couldn't believe he made it to the 5th round. There were some questions about him coming out. You heard different things about questions about his injury history and his ability to stay on the field. These were the sort of questions. But when he was out there, he was just as electric, as fast a guy as you'll see playing in college football.
Yeah, Playmaker Score also. Playmaker Score just absolutely loved Stephon Diggs. So that is a really talented guy, no question about it. He's a big part of the success. As far as home and road, here's what I'll say, which is, in general, certain teams having a bigger home field advantage than other team really tends to dissipate over the long run, with the really strong exception of the Seattle Seahawks. Mm-hmm. Most teams generally end up with the same home field advantage over the long run. I think what does maybe matter a little bit is that teams that play indoors often build for indoors, and they build offenses that will be faster on turf. But both of these teams play in dome stadiums. So I don't think that's an issue. They both get to play indoors at home, and they both get to play indoors this week in this game. So I don't see that as being a big problem.
Right, not a big issue. Crowd noise, of course, when you're going on the road will be a little bit of a different thing to handle. But I think the quarterbacks and the great stats from Keenum and Bradford, I'll be interesting to see how those go when those guys have to go outside.
Yeah, I will say the other game is one where home field advantage matters more, I think. It's interesting that Denver doesn't generally come out with a stronger home field advantage than most other stadiums, because in other sports, Denver always comes out with the strongest home field advantage. And in the NFL, at least in our numbers, we haven't really seen that.
Right, not a lot of the altitude effect coming through. Although back when you think of the Mike Shanahan years, the Denver was a very strong home team.
I think in this game, it's really interesting. You know, after week 2, I got a lot of email from Denver fans about our Denver projection, that were like, where's your 6-win projection for Denver now? Then Denver went out in week 3 and sort of played as we had projected, which also, by the way, doesn't mean the projection will turn out to be completely accurate, because the loss to Buffalo was also only one game. But what we've seen from Denver this year is the pass defense is not as good as it's been the last couple of years. They're number 1 in run defense right now, but they're only 16th in pass defense. They've given up 7 passing touchdowns. Last year, it took them something like half the season to give up 7 passing touchdowns.
I'm really interested to see from a pass rush perspective how this matchup goes, because you're looking at two teams. The traditional stats would tell us they each have 6 sacks through 3 games. But when we look in terms of pressure rate, and we talk about a pressure, that's did you record either a hit, hurry, sack, or knockdown on the play. The Broncos are 4th in the NFL with 42 plays with pressure this year, while the Raiders are 27th with just 26 total pressures. So while I think most people would prefer Derek Carr to Trevor Siemian in most situations, based on the quality of the pass rush that these guys are going to go up against, I'm really interested to see how things play out. The Raiders had certainly an off week from an offensive line perspective, so maybe they can recover some, but the Broncos D-line is a tough matchup for anybody.
And when you flip it, Siemian against Buffalo was not as good as Siemian against Dallas. And I think, he's not he might be better than we expected, but he's not a good quarterback. But that Denver defense the Oakland defense has been awful so far this year, 30th in defensive DVOA, and dead last in the league on third downs.
Up next, we're joined by a very special guest, Mike Tanier. He's the NFL national lead writer for Bleacher Report, the author of A Good Walkthrough Spoiled, and a co-author on the Football Outsiders Almanac, along with, of course, Aaron Schatz. Mike, how's it going?
Living the dream here in beautiful Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. One of only half the teams in the NFL where we have a 2-1 team here in the city.
Yeah, pretty much like the whole NFL is 2-1, except the teams that are 0-3 and the Chiefs.
So you wrote a piece on the Seahawks this week that I'm interested in hearing about. What have you found about the Seahawks and the start of their season?
Well, they're one of the teams who's not 2-1. They're 1-2, and their big win was against the 49ers, just an ugly, sloppy win right now. And, I think we know the Seahawks to a degree, like their brand of football. Their brand of football is all about the Legion of Boom. It's all about that defense. And it's Russell Wilson kind of running for his life on the freeway behind that offensive line. And, that's all well and good when you were kind of making the Super Bowl with that brand of football, but it's gone back to being, 10-5-1 or 10-6 and what they've done in the past. And now they're off to another slow start, and they've become worse at what they were bad at and not quite as great as what they were great at, and that the defense is a little sloppier than it used to be. And the offensive line, and I went to Aaron and you guys for the stats on this, the pressure rate on Russell Wilson has gone from insane to just catastrophic right now, and their entire offense consists entirely of him running around in circles and throwing bombs.
Yeah, 42.3% of dropbacks. That's the pressure rate from the Sports Info Solutions charting, which is just pathetic. And I think the worst that, certainly look, it's not going to be that over an entire season, but if it was that over an entire season, that would be the worst we've ever seen.
And let me ask, because it's like, that means flat out 42% of pass plays he's pressured, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so I watched the Giants last week against the Eagles, and the pressure rate had to have dipped a little bit because the entire playbook was get ball, Eli, throw ball, Eli, almost immediately, and just insanely quick passes, et cetera, et cetera. And even doing that apparently must not be working for the Seahawks in that should take your pressure rate down, like past 30% or whatever, if like 3 or 4 passes per series are these incredibly quick passes.
Yeah, so like a pressure isn't necessarily always a pressure. They're not all created equal. And certainly with Russell Wilson, he wants to hold the ball. He wants to get back there and run around a little bit and break the defense down. And so he's going to be affected by that much more than somebody like Eli Manning running the Ben McAdoo offense, just get it out of your hands as fast as possible.
But where is the adjustment then for the Seahawks? Like, this has been 3 years of this. And yes, I know that Russell Wilson, he can buy time and do things. Where is the adjustment and just say, we have to build the whole offense around this protection about whether it's getting the ball out quicker, 6-man, 7-man protection, et cetera. After 3 years, where's the adjustment on this?
Right, and you note that a lot of the gimmick plays are gone. And look, I'm not a fan of the wide receiver screen. That's sort of become my latest outrage on Twitter is I want to kill the wide receiver screen, but sometimes it does work. And the Seahawks are a team where when you had a guy like Percy Harvin and you could get the ball out of the hands of the quarterback quickly, it was a way to get around the problems with the offensive line. And now they're not doing stuff like that. It's just a lot of deep throws, and that line is not going to protect for deep throws.
And look at how the Chiefs do it, because I think the Chiefs do it the way the Seahawks used to do it. They've got Tyreek Hill, obviously. They got a running game. So you can have the option threat, you can have the power running threat, and the screen is kind of like the third counterplay off of that, where you say, if I fake the handoff to Marshawn Lynch or Kareem Hunt and throw it out there to Tyreek Hill, that's going to give more opportunity than just keep farting the ball out there to Tyreek Hill. And the flip side of that is once you've established that that's a big threat on the outside with a Harvin or a Hill, then you're not going to have 8-man boxes on the other side. Very simple, basic football concept. For whatever reason, the Seahawks, who could still do that with guys like Lockett or Richardson, have abandoned that in favor of whatever they're trying to do right now, which is run around and throw Hail Marys with 8 minutes left in the game.
So now, of course, we've made these arguments every year about the Seattle offense, and I feel like the Seattle offense starts slow every year. The difference this year, though, is the defense not playing particularly well. They're getting just gashed by running backs.
And they're on the field a lot, and I think that's part of it, where the first quarter they had control of that game against the Titans. Like the first couple series, Titans couldn't run the ball, and that's their bread and butter, et cetera, et cetera. Then you had a bunch of offsides penalties. You had Cuckoo Bananas Crazy Town from Richard Sherman, which added 45 yards of penalties and fired up the team, et cetera, et cetera. But in the past, that wasn't an issue. They could go back and forth and win lots of 12-6 and 13-10 games. Now, when they get in those situations, they get a lapse or two in the second half. Looks like maybe they're a little more tired, maybe they're a little over-aggressive, whatever. But it's one thing for Aaron Rodgers to complete a couple big passes against them. It's another thing for DeMarco Murray and Derrick Henry to just start slamming the ball down their throats.
Yeah, it comes back to playing complementary football, and I think it's become something that's more difficult for them now because they've lost a lot of players in free agency. It was one thing when these guys were all young and on their first contracts, but then a couple of these guys had to get paid. And the big one is the Max Unger trade, which I don't think the offensive line has ever recovered from.
No, and they've never come up with a good plan around that. I know they have drafted a lot of linemen here, but it's always a half-measure type of thing. Like, oh, we drafted a lineman in the second round, fourth round, and the seventh round, and we got Luke Jokel, whatever his name is, from the Seahawks. That's not what you have to do at this point. You either have to get out there and just take all of your resources and invest it in fixing that line, or you have to change the way your offense does business and say, oh, we're going to be more about, two tight ends, or bring that option element back. They've decided to do neither. It's impacting them. And the half measure has been to get additional guys on defense. That has helped. But you see, when it goes from all-world to all-pro to top 10 in the league, that feels it when the offense is bad. You don't stay on that Super Bowl caliber line that they were on.
I will have to give them a little bit of credit. At least in the last couple of years, they are trying to work on the line. I mean, they took Ifedi in the first round last year, and then they took, what's his name, Ethan Pockich. I'm not sure how to pronounce this year. But if you're going to be a team that's needy on the offensive line, and you're going to take an offensive lineman with a really high pick, you should probably play that guy. Like, Pockich isn't playing.
And he's like a four-position guy. Like, we don't know. He was a center in college, and center is Justin Britt's position, because after 5 tries, they got Justin Britt into a position where he's decent, so they get in and get another center. I think he's a good ball player. They don't know where they're putting him. And again, that's a second-round pick. I think, Ifedi was a late first-round pick. They are putting some resources in there, but it's got to be extreme emergency stuff. We've seen team saturation draft, where it's like first 3 picks are defensive backs and stuff like that. That's what the Seahawks have had to do for 3 years. It's still, in my opinion, been a half measure.
Right. So moving forward from there, let's talk about the Eagles. Mike, you're a Philadelphia guy. What's going on with the Eagles this year?
Well, let's see. I'm heading over there right after I get off the phone and talk to some of the guys out there. And let's see, we're the most political team in the NFL, but I don't think we want to get into that right now. And everyone, we come off this big win. The Eagles come off this big win against the Giants with a 61-yard field goal at the end. And the entire conversation in Philadelphia is about the fact that Doug Peterson went for a 4th and 8 before halftime, and Carson Wentz took a sack on 4th and 8 before halftime and gave the Giants a chance to come down. And luckily, the Giants did Giant stuff. They got into the goal line and ran a stupid play on 4th down. But it was a potential disaster from the Eagles coaching staff. And this turned into, of course, as it always does on talk radio, this long conversation about the use of analytics, as analytics are perceived, not by those of us like the 3 of us who do it, but by guys like Howard Eskin on Sports Talk Radio, and people coming after Doug Peterson because of that.
Yeah, they were in no man's land on that play, right? It's the Giants 43. That's one of those places where it's usually too long to kick a field goal unless you have Jake Elliott and it's the end of the game.
Right.
But I think that's the kind of play where I would say 4th and 2, 4th and 3, 4th and 4, those are all good. Go for it. Mm-hmm. 4th and 8, that's really stretching it. I think the punt might be better in that case.
Yeah, and what I did is I went, because I think Jeffrey Lurie said, well, we played the percentages on that. And Peterson said something like, well, the percentages were, and they grabbed 4th and long percentages, I suppose. Well, I went into our data. I went into the databases, because and I know 4th and 8, the entire sample size is the Browns against the Steelers with the score 33-7 in the 4th quarter. Teams don't go for 4th and 8s a lot. And when you take out those desperation 4th quarter down by 2 touchdown plays, you take away some fake punts, some fake field goals, and I found a sample of 10 4th and more than 6 go-for-its in 2016. Now, if you're trying to do analytics off of 10 samples per year, stretch across the entire NFL, you have to tread very, very lightly. And you can't really draw these massive conclusions out of that. And I think that's something to keep in mind when we have the analytics conversation. There's some things that the evidence is scant or it's just not great, and it really is a judgment call.
Well, you said tread lightly there, but there's no tread at all when you talk about 10 attempts. I mean, that's, from an analytic perspective, that is completely worthless, and it's just anecdotal. There's nothing more to it than that. For me, I'd much rather be interested in what do you do on 3rd and 8 in this situation? What are your percentages in 3rd and 8? Maybe you can look at that that over the course of a year or something, and then you can actually have a sample that is kind of apples to apples and can at least educate you a little bit. But the fourth down numbers, it's ridiculous.
I'm worried about that data set in that it gets very dirty because some teams might be playing for the field goal, moving field position. You'll get a lot of situations where guys are making room for the punter, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So you're going to get different in offensive and defensive calls, and then you have the field position. You're going to get a sample that's bigger, but it's going to be dirtier data, and you're kind of got to be right back where you start from.
Right. We probably have to control at that point for situational factors like who's leading, who's behind, and what the margin is, but absolutely.
I think the good news for the Eagles is that Carson Wentz is playing better than he did as a rookie. You've seen the improvement in the second year that we all wanted to see. He's throwing deep more often. That makes Scott Kazmar happy.
Thank you.
They're running the ball well. Sorry, what were you going to say?
Hi, Scott.
Every time Carson Wentz throws the ball over 16 yards, I want to be like, hey, woo, Scott, what's up, man?
Yeah, you and the entire Eagles media's headquarters, but
but I mean, the thing is, Scott and Kian were right about that last year. It was in some way, I think we will learn over the long run that what happened last year with Carson Wentz throwing short was in part related to being a rookie and the wide receivers on the team, and maybe less about Carson Wentz himself in the long run.
Yeah, and what you're seeing in the stats is that he's throwing long more. He's getting more, chunk plays, more third down and medium to long conversions, going back to that a little bit. What you're seeing on the field is that he's more mobile in the pocket. You're seeing that he can make more checks and calls and things like that at the line. And that's all what you expect from rookie development. I think we've lost sight of the fact that the rookies still develop in the NFL, that, maybe you get these Dak Prescotts to go out and are immediate successes to a certain degree. But these guys still have incredible amounts to learn, and that there's going to be development. You see that with Wentz. I think we see that with Goff right now, and that's not unusual. And it's not always appropriate to say this is what he is when you make that determination after 3 games, 5 games, 1 game, whatever.
So I'll also point out that the Eagles are 14th in our ratings so far, but that's without opponent adjustments. And the little thingy I did on the site this week, sort of what would opponent adjustments look like if we included them now. The Eagles look like they're going to be the team that maybe gets helped the most by opponent adjustments when we throw them in next week. Obviously, the Giants are not a good team, but Washington and Kansas City have been 2 of the best teams in the league so far. Kansas City has been the best team in the league so far.
Oh, yes.
So I'm glad that Dak Prescott was brought up in the discussion of Carson Wentz, because when you actually look at Carson Wentz, yes, he has been throwing the ball downfield more this year. There's no question about that. Still, though, he's 18th in the league in quarterback rating. And just looking around on the data hub, I see 19th in quarterback rating is Dak Prescott. Even more remarkable, Carson Wentz has completed 71 passes this season. Dak Prescott, 67. They each have 5 touchdowns. They each have 2 interceptions. Carson Wentz is at 61%. Dak Prescott is at 62.6% completions. Quarterback rating, 89.6, 88.9. They're having almost identical years statistically so far. And I find it fascinating when the narrative was so different last year, when actually these are guys that might actually be sort of similar as players and the different size guys, but the skill set is not so far off. And they were just put into incredibly different situations.
Absolutely. And I think what we saw this year in one particular game, the Denver game, hey, Dak Prescott, here's what it's like to be behind by more than a score and not have it be 2nd and 3 every time you drop the pass because Elliott gains 7 yards and first down. And that's not a knock on the guy, but you see a different quarterback under those situations. And you see them pressing more and you see the same mistakes. And we have seen a little bit more of Carson Wentz now. Here are some more people to throw to. Here's a little bit more of a consistent running game. And here are some more favorable situations in some of these games. And you're seeing a different guy on that, and they come towards the middle. And that's why, preaching to the choir among the 3 of us, there's an incredible situational element to both the statistics of the quarterbacks and the perception of the quarterbacks. And we can probably throw Goff in there as well, in that he's now faced 2 very weak opponents, but he's now playing in a better system. He's now had more opportunities to play with leads, not in desperate situation. And right now his statistics, I believe, look phenomenal.
I'll ask you one other question about the Eagles going forward, which is, what do you think happens with Doug Peterson's offense where they're going to now miss that receiving back guy, right? Because now that Darren Sproles is done for the year and Donnell Pumphrey, who is supposed to be Sproles' replacement, is done for the year, what happens to that aspect of the Philadelphia offense?
I think that's a real mystery, and that's a real question. Right now people are worried about Fletcher Cox, legitimately, because the strength of the team is supposed to be the front four, and that takes something out. But the Sproles factor, we've seen this offense enough. The screen game is an incredibly large portion of the offense, as is that kind of outside rushing game. Now, you don't get either of those legitimately from LeGarrette Blount. Wendell Smallwood is just a guy, I think, in my opinion. And the young man Clement, who's going to be taking over some of this, is another kind of just a guy, maybe with a little bit of upside. So now we got to adjust a little bit. What we're waiting to see in Philadelphia is really the explosion of these wide receivers. Alshon Jeffrey only has a handful of catches, a couple of big third down conversions. But downfield, Wentz is still not consistently hitting Jeffries. Him and Smith are kind of sometimes on the same page, but there's been a pass drop. There's been other things like that. That is what should rise up at some point and overcome that need to constantly go to the screen. If they can't do that, there may be a transition on this offense, and it might not be as strong as it's looked in the first couple of weeks.
Mike Tanier of Bleacher Report. It's been a pleasure having you on, and hopefully we can do it again soon later on this year. We'll look out for your Monday morning digest every week on Bleacher Report. And your Twitter handle for the folks at home?
At Mike Tanier. That's at Mike, T as in Tango, A-N-I-E-R.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike.
Always a pleasure. Take care, guys.
This has been the Week 4 edition of the Off the Charts Football Podcast. As a reminder, charting data and projections are for sale on footballoutsiders.com, courtesy of Sports Info Solutions charting data. You can also subscribe to the Off the Charts podcast on iTunes or Stitcher by searching Off the Charts. Also, follow us on Twitter at FBOutsiders and at sportsinfo_SIS. And of course, a very special thank you to our guest, Mike Tanier of Bleacher Report. If there's anything you'd like to hear us discuss on the show in the future, anything you'd like to learn about as it pertains to football scouting or analytics, you can tweet us a question at sportsinfo_SIS. Let us know what you'd like to hear us talk about. Have a great weekend of football. We'll see you next week.